Hello, and thank you for being here. I'm gonna be mindful of the time and I'm gonna let, I think, enough time for interaction. But if at any point in the presentation you feel like you wanna have an input or a question, please feel free to do so. I think it's better for us to do so. What we're gonna do today is basically take a look at why it's extremely important for Europe in the upcoming year to take a position and be extremely supportive of Ukraine in its resisting war against the Russian aggression, and how the fact that the US having an extremely, let's say, tension position now with the upcoming elections means that Europe has more than ever responsibility to take the role of supporting Ukraine. Unfortunately, that's not the reality and the case, especially in the neighboring countries, where the support for Ukraine has eroded, hence the Black Sea region. What am I going to talk about today? I'm going to talk about Romania, Bulgaria, and a little bit about Ukraine and the Republic of Moldova being probably, most likely in December, the newest accession member countries to the European Union. Now, having this in mind, the disclaimers are that in this Black Sea region that we're talking about today, there are no successful Belt and Road Initiative projects. This means that China, the PRC, has not successfully managed to put a grasp and have tangible projects in this region. This has happened for multiple reasons. For example, in Romania and Bulgaria, it has failed to do so in the nuclear industry, also aviation and automobile industry, mainly because it was also an inefficient management from the part of the Chinese investors, but also because of the political spectrum that shifted more and more towards the European Union and more detaching itself from these Chinese BRI type investment. So just to quickly clarify, this is gonna be, okay. What we did at Expert Forum was to take a look basically at main actors in each country, from political parties to influencers that also act as political influencers, and also at media sources, an extremely important disclaimer being that TV is also important in these countries, just taking a look at that a little bit later. The channels that we analyze in this Black Sea region is mainly Facebook, because it's still the main information source, closely followed by subsequent sources like Telegram, Viber if it's for Ukraine, and for youth and Gen Z, TikTok, which is also something extremely interesting but under research, including by us in the Black Sea region. If you're curious about the methodology, we can have a quick chat later. I'm not going to dive into this, but basically we mainly use CrowdTangle, which is the official meta tool, which allows you to export data based on specified queries. We also have predefined lists of the actors that we monitor, but we also use auxiliary sources like private software like Brand24, Pulsar, Exolit, which is a Finnish startup, and others. Happy to chat about the technology if you are geeking about that in the questions. An extremely important disclaimer, not to undermine our research, is that in this part of Europe, TV is still extremely important. We do have in Romania, Bulgaria, Ukraine, the Republic of Moldova, huge rural population that are still highly dependent of the TV channels and the information that is spread to them through the TV channels. So this is the latest data from the Reuters Institute. In digital news, we still see that TV is highly in competition with online sources, even though we have decent penetration rates of internet above 60%. Now, this is also the case for Ukraine and the Republic of Moldova, when we still have a lot of TV channels that are, let's say, historically bought by specific parties that promote their own agenda. Usually what happened to this part of the world is that we see these agents more and more translating these materials into the online space, basically having the same media sources that we have on TV, like, let's say, Romania TV, which is easy to understand why it exists, also in online, having the same type of websites, having huge amounts of money to pour into advertising and anti-EU narratives, and so on. Now, going to quickly over Romania. What we analyzed, so this is gonna be the same type of slide for all the countries, so I hope it's gonna be easy to understand. We analyzed potential hostile narratives in all of these countries regarding NATO, energy security, refugees, and sanctions, which were the biggest topics last year in this part of the world. What we basically saw that for the specific case of Romania, the biggest problem and the biggest potential for hostile narratives was the anti-American sentiment translated and transmitted through NATO narratives. What does this mean? For example, I don't know if you're familiar with this example, we had a grain crisis provoked by the fact that wheat transport went freely through Romania, Poland, from Ukraine because it was impossible for Ukraine to transport it through other countries, which provoked a spike in prices in these countries. This was heavily exploited by far-right politicians, anti-EU and anti-US politicians, as a consequence of war that is hurting the population in these countries. What does this graphic mean? When you see yellow or red highlights, this basically means questionable sources, which is the red ones, and far-right sources, which is the yellow ones. Main sources of information regarding this crisis was not any traditional outlet, but rather far-right politicians and questionable information sources. What do you think was the outcome of this? Obviously, an extremely toxic narrative and an extremely polluted information environment that was heavily anti-Ukrainian. Who benefited from this, comes the question. This is the logo of the far-right party in Romania that is provisioned to have almost 20% in the next parliamentary elections. And we can see how the messages they're promoting and the narratives evolved from boycott Austria, which is the only country in the European Union that it's against Romania's entry in Schengen, which would mean basically no checks and controls for Romania in the EU, how it evolved from this to the fact that the people in Romania that support Ukrainian free grain are traders, and how it all evolved into a political campaign. So basically we see how they use the popularity they gained in a crisis situation to exploit it and gain more and more followers to their platforms. Typical influence operation that we question, where did they had money from? It was extremely well organized. They had trailers also offline that went in various counties in Romania, and that gave them a massive surge in votes, visibility, and also obviously traction in the next elections. The consequences of this when it comes to Ukraine and the stability in the region is that next year, as I've heard it also mentioned, is the year of elections worldwide. This would mean for the Black Sea region that Romania will have for the first time almost 20% of far-right party in the parliament that will also go in the European Parliament. Being a bordering country with Ukraine, this will be extremely problematic in how we position ourselves with the support we offer for Ukraine. When it comes to China, most likely they're oblivious, and we don't think they are quite aware of any interest in that. Mainly because they are an extremely nationalistic party, very concerned about internal issues in Romania. What it meant promoting and basically normalizing this type of, let's say, toxic narratives in Romania is that not only the far-right party does it anymore. I would love to hear how is it in your countries. But in our region, normalizing these toxic behaviors meant that populists and other mainstream parties also adopted harsher stances against Ukraine because it's what the voters needed to hear. They were exposed to so much disinformation that it became common sense to have stances against Ukraine. Now, Bulgaria is different in a bad way, unfortunately, meaning that Bulgaria is a lot more anti-EU and a lot more pro-Russia than we can see in Romania. Why so? This is also because of cultural ties and historic, let's say, nostalgia towards Russia. But more than that, it's also because it has heavily Russian propaganda present on social media, which, as you saw before, is closely connected to media consumption in Bulgaria. So in Bulgaria, from the study, it was the most penetrated country with Russian disinformation when it comes to potentially hostile narratives towards NATO, towards refugees, and against sanctions on Russia. Now, these potential hostile narratives are extremely problematic in Bulgaria, also because the remaining population in Bulgaria, almost, I think, 7 million people, 6.8, I think is the official number, a lot of it is in the rural area. As mentioned, this is extremely important for Eastern Europe because TV channels that are also heavily subsidized by political parties, in Bulgaria even more having ties with Russia, becomes a problem when your population appeals to Russia. According to the European Barometer, the average percentage of support for Ukraine is around 74%. In Bulgaria is 48% in support of giving help to Ukraine to overcome the war. Talking about, let's say, the most discussed country in the last 2 years almost, Ukraine. Here, fortunately and unfortunately, we have good lessons to learn. At least for us in the region, we use it as a success story against internal propaganda. That is because for Ukraine, resisting propaganda meant survival. So basically, without having good strategic communication and good prevention measures against Russia influence operations, that would have meant even more vulnerability in a crisis and war situation. So what we do see is that Ukraine is the most resistant for obvious reasons because it's feeling firsthand the consequences of the war. It's the one at war. But more than that, also because it has taken some preventive measures that we believe have worked, as banning a lot of the propaganda sources coming from Russia, proven to be propaganda sources. Now, even though we do not have anti-Western narratives in Ukraine, there is potential for destabilization when it comes to the recent potential for accession of Ukraine in the European Union. The accession to the European Union is a long-term process, and it needs a lot of reform to fulfill criteria. However, the emergency of the war has created a sense of let's say, despair in the people of wanting to come faster in the European Union, feeling like there is an exception that can be made. Unfortunately, the politics and reality of Europe is that Europeans will not accept that, and most likely Ukraine will not be an exception of these criteria. This could lead to a lot of frustration in the Ukrainian people for just reasons. And how this will be exploited by the hostile narratives and propaganda agents from Russia, this needs to be further analyzed. Until this point, we see how it's exploited in Moldova, and I will show you in a second. Now, Moldova is an extremely small country, yet extremely relevant. It's 2 million people, is it, Sorin? Almost 2 million people? More? Hard to say, because a lot of them are living in diaspora outside the country. So, the Republic of Moldova being at the border with both Romania and Ukraine, having a huge influence from Russia, having a separatist region, Transnistria, that it's actually controlled by Russia, is an extremely important geopolitical country for Europe, because it's the last standing between the European Union and Russia. Now, this country is extremely vulnerable when it comes to the ascension of the European Union. A lot of propaganda narratives have sparked since the announcement of this. A lot of money is being poured into influence operations in in Moldova. What you can easily see is that legitimate fears are being exploited from a lot of, let's say, legitimate reasons, like the fear of losing your own culture and the fear of losing your traditions is being exploited into a broader narrative that kind of tries to promote that the European Union will force Moldova to lose its traditions and will force Moldova to lose its sovereignty. Now, a lot of clusters have been identified, but the most recent ones in November are regarding discrediting Moldova's accession to the EU by claiming that the current government, which is led by a woman, a Harvard-educated woman, Maya Sandu, is not actually gonna make it. It's just an illusion to consider that Moldova will be able to join the EU, and this will basically lead that Moldova will be at the mercy of Russia in the future. An extremely complicated, as geopolitics usually is, situation, but it's extremely easy to instrumentalize and use these narratives against Ukraine and against the stability in the region. Basically identifying the weak links, which in our case are Romania and Bulgaria, in what concerns propaganda, it's easy to do when it comes to a population that is vulnerable to disinformation. Because we don't have time, if you want to know more about other interesting narratives that have been exploited into influence operations, I have some QR codes that can also be available after the presentation. I don't think I have them printed actually. But on our website, expertforum.ro, you can easily find them. Also, some cheers to our partners, because we never do this alone. We have people that we collaborate always. And I think it's extremely important to have highlight on that. If you have any questions, we are happy to answer them, and our contact details are here. Thank you for your attention. Yes, please.
Thank you. So just 1 minute, because we are from the same organization, Expert Forum, which is a think tank based in Bucharest, and we work together in these things. We do monitoring. We also do the China Index. So we are the regional integrator for these countries: Ukraine, Moldova, Romania, not Bulgaria, but Italy and Netherlands, so 5 countries in Europe. Why do we speak so much about Ukraine, Russia, and not so much about China? So there's a logic in this. If you remember in the China Index, we have 3 layers of conclusions and 1. So there's a first cluster is how much a country is exposed to Chinese influence, and that's the first category. The second is how much pressure China is really putting, so the PRC is putting on the country, and then the effects. These countries that we are speaking about today are countries of low pressure by PRC actually, and as analysts we are a bit frustrated. So China is not, the PRC is not present so much. It's like a low point of interest in these countries. So this is not, although 2 of the countries, Romania and Bulgaria, are members of the European Union, they are not treated in the same way like, you know, Germany, obviously, or France, or Italy, you know. And PRC, Beijing, is not treating European Union as an entity, and this is a political, this is deliberate political strategy. They try to split up the countries and have a bilateral dialogue with each of them. They even try to create a format, if you remember, 16+1, 17+1, whatever. So the East European countries, new member states, candidate countries, trying to separate them from the rest of the, more or less failed, like the BRE in our region as well, the BRE initiatives, which we don't have actually. So I'm surprised that after 10 years, people still speak about BRE projects in Eastern Europe like they exist, buying into the PRC narrative. There's nothing on the ground. I mean, it's nothing, they haven't even started in countries like Romania and Bulgaria. It was a memorandum signed in 12 or 14, and nothing happened, absolutely. It's a bit different in Greece, but that's it. So the idea is that first, PRC is piggybacking on the actions of the main actor in the region, which is Russia, Kremlin. So very much if they want to undermine the global political architecture, to divide the West, so to speak, or the collective West, as Vladimir Putin so beautifully puts it now, they play into the narratives which more or less in our region originate in Kremlin. There's no much interest in these countries. So when you see when you see a difference in effect, you know, so when some countries are really, you know, friendly with China, trying to do deals with China, and this is a case in our region, obviously Hungary and Serbia. One is a member, one is not a member, it's a candidate countries. This is a factor of internal politics, of maverick leaders who are strong men, because they are men, Viktor Orban and Alexander Vucic. And they are very instrumental. They are not doing this because they love China or because they have a certain ideology, but they do it primarily for internal political purposes, because in a certain way it plays well with the public, because it creates for them political opportunities. And for a member country like Hungary, it's very good because it opens up the space 360%. They can play actors against each other. They can create problems in Brussels by appearing to play with Beijing and the other way around, you know. So it's very, very instrumental, very strategic, not value-based or something else. So it's very contextual. If you have a leader after certain elections in one of these countries, they can very, you know, start to play the same strategy. It just didn't happen in these countries. So the propaganda as well is very much originating domestically in these countries. So whenever most of these actors, most of the narratives, and this is very strange and frustrating actually, they originate in our political leaders in each of the countries. It's not so much that Beijing, Xi Jinping, or even Vladimir Putin is paying someone to say something on our TV. It's our leaders actually who are buying, you know, who are borrowing, copy-pasting narratives, a little bit changing it for national context and using for domestic political advantage. So our disinformation in this region is very much a factor of domestic politics. Borrowing narratives, themes, memes from, you know, these global narratives. And when the wind of change blows, as it does these days, you know, when anti-EU, anti-NATO, anti-American narratives, which is the base of everything, you know, it contains many forms on the left or on the right. When they become popular for some reason, you know, they tend to take these forms. I think it is something that we need to keep in mind, and not you know, blame very much Moscow or Beijing for what happens in the politics of these countries, because very much the bad things, manipulation, propaganda, fake news, disinformation originate at home. They have their own motivation. They just buy, you know, from the big menu of issues that the big actors put. And I will stop here because we really need to take comments on questions from you. And I will pass it back to Madalina.
Yes, please. Thank you.
I don't need this, I can speak.
Oh, I
So, all right, now. All right, so it's a basic question, and I kind of understand your argument about how domestic actors are not necessarily kind of, you know, recuperating or you know, cooperating with Beijing or Moscow. I get that. What I'm interested in is whether or not Moscow or Beijing sees this as an opportunity for them to push narratives. So there's a difference between creating content and amplifying content. And what we've seen in the past is that sometimes maybe they're not creating content, but they're extremely good at looking at internal divisions and like, hey, look, I'm going to amplify this and make this wrong. The same thing that Iran does with the Hamas things, like we're seeing these. So you might not see these connections as, in terms of like feeding that to the actors more so than just pushing and putting their thumb on the scales. So there's a difference, and can you measure this and see the difference?
Can I give a short answer, then give it to you? So I completely agree with this. I mean, even if you cannot track specifically to an influence operation from Russia, you can easily track how anti-COVID bubbles have evolved into anti-American bubbles in the Black Sea region that are also pro-Russian, which is, a coincidence, you might say. So for example, in Romania, I would definitely say that we have a lot of pages and a lot of websites that do seem clones from different websites that promote the same narratives as, let's say, Russian state media promotes. So if this is this copy paste? Is it actually paid content? We cannot specifically prove, but what we do know is that this amplifying effect does exist and is extremely important in disseminating propaganda.
No, you're right, and I oversimplified in two ways. So first, of course, if you speak about Ukraine and Moldova, the situation is much more complex because they are in a way culturally part of the Ruski Mir, the broader Russian world, in the sense that the population is really bilingual and they are exposed directly, for example, to Russian TV channels which broadcast for the domestic public, which is a totally different world from Romania, Bulgaria, and everyone else in Europe. So that's one thing. And second, Kremlin and the whole ecosystem of propaganda in Russia is vastly more competent than the Chinese one in Eastern Europe, because they know the context, they know the details, and we've been together for 200 years, you know, they've been present in this historical reality. So they are very good at exploiting, you know, existing fractures, cleavages in societies, real problems. And EU is a very complicated beast, and many times between countries there are divergences of interest, which are normal, and they are solved in a framework. They know how to exploit, how to create polarization, much better. Beijing and the Chinese propaganda is very robotic, very awkward. They don't understand the region, and sometimes, I mean, I'm amazed how can they still be present with the blunders they make in terms of you know, embassies not being present in the right place. For example, for Beijing, the Chinese embassy in Kiev, in Ukraine, it's still somehow subordinated to the one in Moscow today, with war going on. So when they want to do something friendly with Ukraine, they need to clear out with the other embassy in Moscow, which is crazy, and the Ukrainians know it, and you can imagine what the effect is. But they're still doing it because they have this imperial mentality, which is the same that the Kremlin has, you know, to treat, you know, civilizational states, and for them, Ukraine still belongs to Moscow somehow, you know, it's like a sort of subordination. Yes. Yeah, there are questions, we don't have minutes.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. This is like a more speculative question. I'm just wondering, given that Taiwan is kind of growing this relationship with Eastern Europe in terms of like in the Baltic countries, like with Lithuania as an obvious example, and there have been talks with Estonia, I think, about representative offices as well. If this will give China incentive to kind of make more overtures in other Eastern European states where they already like have some sort of presence, even if it's just like, you know, piggybacking on like Russia's influence?
Yeah, so short answer, and then I'll let Sorin also give his. So my short answer is that I think that obviously China tries to have its own narratives present in the region, but as Sorin mentioned, they're very bad at it because it's extremely different from the region. PRC is accustomed to basically have influence. The internet is very different as well, so the sources. But I think that piggybacking on this is, in my opinion, is not going to be that successful, not even in the Russia agenda, trying to somehow use that, mainly because there are other more interesting, let's say, narratives for Russia to promote in the region rather than focus on Taiwan. But these are just my 2 cents.
Yeah, as you know, Taiwan has a representative in Brussels for the European Union. There's a second representative in Bratislava, capital of Slovakia, so for Eastern Europe somehow. And we cooperated with them, by the way, in some conferences. Now, to what extent our states, the national states, engage with Taiwan or not, it depends. It's a factor of national politics, how they perceive. But Indeed, the countries that opened up to Taiwan, like the Baltics or Czech Republic, which was very active, you know, with its official delegations to Taipei, it provoked a hostile reaction from Beijing, as you would expect, and it backfired tremendously. I'm not sure how they realize in Beijing how much it backfires. So they are perceived as a hostile actor. So I'm not sure it plays well for them. But again, it's a sovereign decision in every country. There's no decision at the European level how to engage with Taiwan. And I think, I mean, we are civil society. We don't represent the government. I'd like to see my country to engage more openly with Taiwan. But, you know, that's, and we fight actually with our Ministry of Foreign Affairs and with our parliamentarians to become members of IPAC and to do it more officially, so to follow in the lead of Czech Republic and the Baltics. So we press for that as civil society, but politics is different. So this is where we are.
Yeah. Thank you very much for the research and the clear findings you presented. I want to know just if in your opinion, taking in account all the findings, there are some learnings and maybe recommendation you may have for those actors doing media literacy and education to media and information for the citizens of the region. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So we actually tried and are trying media literacy also efforts based on these findings in Romania and the Republic of Moldova. It's not easy, but I would say it works long term, but it's very hard to quantify the efforts. We actually went to Transylvania, to the ethnic Hungarian community, and had some trainings there trying to see how the Fidesz, Viktor Orban, narratives were, like, let's say, can be rebutted there. But I think the media literacy efforts are very hard to quantify, but are a necessity and a must-have. Based on our findings, what I would say is, let's say, surprising, but it works, is that banning proven Russian state media websites work. They do decrease the reach, and they do decrease the rate of amplifying this type of clone websites that spread disinformation. So, for example, the Republic of Moldova, a small country, did it, but Romania didn't ban these websites. So you can see the difference in the information space. Fortunately, Romania and Moldova speak the same language, so also a lot of these websites, Romanian weren't able to access anymore because they were banned by the Moldavians.
So just two more words, and I know we are over time, but this is really important. I mean, there's been discussion, a lot of discussion all these years about how to fight back, how to, you know, and I think what we learned is that instruments differ. It's one thing if you address Generation Z or kids or teenagers who are still in school, you can have educational projects, and we have those. We go in schools with syllabi, you know, trying to develop critical thinking. General critical thinking is very important. And it's another story if you address adults or even senior adults. Who are not so much digitally literate, you know, so you need to adapt instruments to your, and the difficulty is, what we learn is that by and large, simple fact-checking, debunking doesn't work. Because as you know, people have a mental filter, and they believe what they want to believe, and this is based on deep values, on identity, so they can filter out whatever you tell them which doesn't fit their frame of mind. You come with the right information, they just don't hear you. And it's true for all age groups and all you know, educational levels. So how can we overcome that? How can we really reach to people? It's very, very deep, it's very contextual based. In our part of the world, Eastern Europe, political identities color your views, so what you absorb from the media, and political identities are very much formed in these countries on the deep historical narratives. Who did what to whom during the World War II? How do you interpret the history of the Soviet Union? You are left, right, and based on these deep identities, people hear you or they don't hear you. They just shut off when you speak, you know. And this is very difficult. It's a very subtle process. It's a little bit like de-radicalization, you know. So we have to really think hard, because simply debunking, telling the truth, doesn't work, especially on online, on social media. So we need to be very sophisticated and think hard and go very deep into how people learn and process information. I think we really need to stop here, right?
Yeah,
Thank you very much.